in the 1800s during this market revolution, we had the invention of interchangeable parts by John Hall. He had his own building at the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is today West Virginia. But by interchangeable parts, what I mean is he invented a machinery that can replicate the making of an item, and they could take apart the item, multiple items, and put them back together without numbering the parts. Think of it this way. If you buy a piece of furniture from Walmart and one piece breaks, what do? You call up and you get the piece. They are interchangeable. They're identical to each other. The impetus behind this was the U.S. government's desire to build rifles. This was an arsenal. They were making rifles. If a rifle broke on the battlefield, it can be easily fixed. They were not unique. They were basically clones of each other, these rifles, once interchangeable parts was invented. Great advancements in the invention of factory machinery. All right, so once we get towards the end of the unit, more about the transition from being an artisan to a factory worker, John Hall plays a big part in that. Because once you can make something with interchangeable parts, you can divide up labor. So instead of an artisan doing the same thing from beginning to end, you can have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people doing one part of it so many times a day. So this goes a long way into moving the artisan from the storefront, making a product from beginning to end, and moving him into the factory, which will eventually become the assembly line in the early 20th century. All right, but interchangeable parts is very, very important, okay, because it begins the process whereby the market revolution moves forward and artisans are pushed by the end of the 19th century into the factory. So again, interchangeable parts means you can make 2 separate items in 2 separate states. You can meet in the middle, take them apart, not number the parts, not label them, and put them back together, and they are identical to each other. Okay, the parts are identical. Instead of a human being making the parts, you have a machine making the parts. He was not well liked by the other workers at the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, John Hall, that is. All right, we have Sam Slater, the father of the factory. If you look at the notes underneath here, the first factory in America was established in 1790 at Pawtucket, Rhode Island by Sam Slater, an English immigrant who built from memory a spinning jenny in order to evade laws making it illegal to export plans for industrial machines. So he memorized the plans. These early spinning factories produced yarn, which through the, quote, outwork system, meaning hiring some people outside the factory, was sent out to rural farm families who wove it into cloth. So his factory was first, but he was unable to keep it all in-house. Some parts of the production process had to be contracted out to kind of the family economy, mother and kids making things. So the same outwork system characterized early shoe production, for example, in which parts were sent out to families who assembled them and gave them back to merchants, who finally sold the shoe. But shoemaking and textiles was eventually brought under one factory roof. Eventually. But again, we're moving slowly into this market revolution. Next, we have John Deere inventing the steel plow. Huge invention. Plows used to be wooden, they would rot, they were slow, they were tougher to drag. John Deere invents the steel plow. It would make this kind of singing noise as it would easily slide through the soil. So it was called a singing plow. It really increased production for a farmer. They could now plow much quicker. Now they could also, and by the way, that was 1837. Now we get to Cyrus McCormick and the mechanical reaper. They can harvest quicker. All right, 1831. So this is putting increasing pressure on the farmer. All right, it used to be where if you were a farmer, you were in the moral economy. If you couldn't make something, you would trade it with your friend farmer, say down the block, or whoever you want to say it. And so your neighbors were they cooperated with you. They were not your competitors. You were not in the cash economy. It was the moral economy. Now that you can, you have to spend money to farm quicker, to plow quicker, to harvest quicker. Now farmers are kind of being pushed into the cash economy. You invest, you take loans to buy these machines. You got to have the crops. How do you pay these loans back? You got to make sure it happens. So increasingly, farmers would lose their farms. They would be more vulnerable to the fluctuations of the economy because they were now entering the cash economy. Farming became less about survival and growing what you need, and more about selling your crops. and the farmer down the road became your competitor as you were being pushed into the cash economy. We will talk more about that in class. Next, we have Samuel Morse invents the telegraph. Looking at the notes, the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s by Samuel F. Morse allowed for instantaneous communication, so information can now travel faster than a horse. First used commercially in 1844, the telegraph served businesses and newspapers by helping speed information flow and bringing uniformity to prices. Huge invention. And telegraph lines would follow the railroads. They would just put telegraph lines, what we now call telephone poles, along railroad routes. Alright? Huge invention. Information can now travel faster. Moving on. The Northern Industrial Juggernaut, Part 2. So the Supreme Court, more or less, I'm not going to go into each of these court cases, but the Supreme Court was more or less business friendly. They kept finding in favor of business interests. So generally speaking, the U.S. government creates a business-friendly climate. In these specific Supreme Court cases, McCulloch v. Maryland, Gibbons v. Ogden, the Charles Rivers Bridge case, and in 1848, for example, New York State passes a general incorporation law. Before this law, corporations had to get a charter from their municipality, and in addition to providing a business plan, they had to prove that they will help out their society. Well, New York is the first state to say you don't have to prove that you will help out society. A general incorporation law. Okay? And it was designed to encourage manufacturing. Alright, so the government was also pretty laissez-faire, hands-off, classical liberalism. But, on the other hand, it did do much, as we just said, to assist the market revolution, to assist manufacturing, to assist capitalism. So it wasn't totally hands-off. Alright, now, an effect of this market revolution. Wealth began to be more unequally distributed. So, before the market revolution, during the American Revolution, 45% of all the wealth was in the top 10% of the population. Not that great, but in 1845, during the market revolution, the top 4% owned over 65% of the wealth. The numbers are even worse now. In 1860, also in Philadelphia, the top 1% owned about 50% of the wealth. That's more like modern-day numbers and getting worse. So the gap between the rich and the poor was widening, as artisans were being pushed into the factory. Slowly but surely being pushed into the factory, out of the storefront. That paid better. The storefront paid better than the factory did. Alright, so what's happening in America by the 1850s? Regional specialization. The East was industrial, the South, cotton and slavery, the West, they were our farmers, they were our breadbasket. Reading from the notes here. Even though cotton agriculture in some sense commercialized the South, it did not create a dynamic and diversified economy. Cotton plantation slavery simply spread the agrarian slave-based social order of the eastern states westward. The Cotton Kingdom remained rural, and the South's transportation and banking systems were underdeveloped arms of the plantation economy. So the South was not all that developed. They doubled down and invested into slavery. The North began to invest more in manufacturing, the West into farming. Manufacturing and technological development here in the South lagged compared to the North. In the North, the market revolution and westward expansion spurred changes that transformed the region into an integrated economy of commercial farms and manufacturing cities. Once isolated farmers, now connected to distant markets by railroads, steamboats, by new transportation routes, and credit, they can borrow money, sold more goods and acquired more cash, which they used to purchase more goods they once made at home. So that was another change in the market. People were now buying more things they used to make for themselves. Western farmers sold their goods and found credit in growing eastern cities. Credit allowed them to purchase the farmers in the West to purchase land, purchase fertilizers, and new agricultural machines such as John Deere's plow and the McCormick's reaper, which greatly increased agricultural productivity in goods such as wheat. So farmers are being pushed into the cash economy.